My name is John Stoltz, Director of Conferences and Events for APICS, and I'll be your host for today's webinar, Furthering Supply Chain Risk Mitigation with S&OP. I'm pleased to be joined today with Greg Schlegel, CPIM. Greg is founder of the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium and an instructor at Lehigh University. In today's presentation, Greg will explore essential knowledge for mitigating and managing uncertainty, complexity, and risk across the entire global value chain. Greg has been a supply chain executive for over 30 years for several Fortune 100 companies and has also served as a past president of APICS. He has authored more than 100 articles published in major supply chain magazines and journals, as well as co-published a new book, Supply Chain Risk Management, an Emerging Discipline. I'm pleased to share that Greg is also a presenter at the APICS 2017 conference, scheduled for October 15th through 17th in San Antonio, Texas, and we're pleased to have him joining us today. You can learn more about the APICS 2017 conference at www.apicsconference.org. As an attendee of this webinar, we are also excited to provide you with a discount off of your full conference registration. Please use code SATXSAVE50 to save $50 when you register at apicsconference.org. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few logistical details with you. At the end of the session, we will save time for a question and answer. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a question box. To ask your question, simply type in the designated box and select Send Question to send at any time during the presentation. Please note that this session also counts as one elective credit hour towards the APICS S&OP Education Certificate and the APICS Supply Chain Risk Management Education Certificates. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted online at apics.org. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today's broadcast, Greg Schlegel.
Thanks, John, for that gracious introduction. Greetings, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be with you today to share some insights on several of our passions. Those passions are supply chain management, S&OP, and risk. Our agenda today looks like this. First, we'll do a quick glimpse of supply chain uncertainty, complexity, and risk. We'll then touch on the basics of supply chain risk management, what we affectionately call SCRM. And we'll discuss the 4 stages of S&OP maturity. We'll then dig into some strategies driving profitability and mitigating supply chain risk within the S&OP process. And then we'll have some closing thoughts. So with that, let's start with supply chain uncertainty, complexity, and risk. Now I start with a busy slide, the wonderful world of uncertainty. I'd like to start here just to get you grounded. Uncertainty, what is it? It's a situation which involves imperfect and/or unknown information according to Wikipedia. And I want to drop down and talk about some concept elements of uncertainty to get you grounded. Let's take a look at the term uncertainty. All right, what is it? The lack of certainty? Well, yes, but it's a state of having limited knowledge where it is impossible to exactly describe the existing state, a future outcome, or more than one possible outcome. Couple more. The measurement of uncertainty, a set of possible states or outcomes where probabilities are assigned to each possible state or outcome. A few more. The term risk, a state of uncertainty where some possible outcomes have an undesirable effect or a significant loss. And finally, measurement of risk. It's a set of measured uncertainties where some possible outcomes are losses to a certain company. So the reality is, folks, we all live with uncertainty every day. And not only uncertainty, but we have more to deal with, and that is complexity. And I'd like to start with I guess a 10-year-old survey from AMR. AMR used to be the premier supply chain research organization, .org if you will, over the last 30 years. AMR has been purchased by Gartner a couple years ago, but AMR used to, in the days in the 80s and 90s, used to do many survey and research programs. One of them I thought was interesting. Back in 2006, they canvassed the world, about 350 corporations around the globe, came up with supply network complexity was increasing in 2006. The average 1 billion with a B company was managing 15 internal manufacturing sites and 38 contract manufacturing providers across 5 supply chains in at least 2 continents. What's it look like today, folks? 10, 11 years later? This is what our supply chains look like. It's gotten more complex. There are more nodes in our global supply chains. Why? Because we all have gone global because of the internet. All right. If you look at it from left to right on this network display, it's our vendors, it's our contract manufacturers, plants, warehouses, distributors, retailers, and customers. So most of us have gone global utilizing the internet. So complexity has gotten worse. And finally, emerging supply chain risks. I submit to you folks, take a look. There's enough risk out there in our global supply chains for everyone, no matter how large or small you are, no matter what you make, or if you are a service organization. So the uncertainty, complexity, and risk is growing every day for all our supply chains. Next, I'd like to get you grounded with a few quick basics on supply chain risk. And we'll start here with our 21st century supply chain risk maturity model. This is from our new book. The book's been out about 2 years, doing quite well. Essentially, it has, as you can see, 4 stages. We'll briefly talk about the stages first. Visibility, predictability, resiliency, and sustainability. Now, on the y-axis of the graph, we have supply chain maturity, from low on the bottom to high at the top. On the x-axis, we have competitive advantage, left to right, from 0 to infinity. Let's go back to the 4 stages. Basically, we have come to the conclusion, and it's in our book, kind of a foundational element of the book, that if you are going to survive and thrive in a global supply chain competition, chances are your organization will have to walk through these 4 stages. Why? Let's talk about visibility. First and foremost, we're talking about end-to-end supply chain visibility. Most of us don't have great end-to-end supply chain visibility, all right? And in the supply chain, from a global perspective, we as risk managers basically say what you don't know about your supply chain can and will hurt you. So visibility is number 1, it's the key. Predictability is next. It may not be exactly what you're thinking about. Predictability in our point of view is how to predict how your supply chain will react to certain risk events or disruptors. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. But we're talking about the ability to model your supply chain, digitize your supply chain, then start to go through scenario planning to actually calculate with statistical confidence how your supply chain will react to certain risk disrupted stimuli. Third, resiliency. That essentially says we advocate that you build an agile, flexible supply chain. And then finally, sustainability, that's basically doing all those three building block elements and then identifying, as we say in our mantra, identifying, assessing, mitigating, and managing risks in your supply chain every day. We also have a few more themes in the book. We think, in our point of view, as your supply chain maturity grows in terms of people, process, and programs, we basically state that your supply chain inherent risks will decrease. And what we do is we actually superimpose a risk heat map associated with the maturity model and those 4 stages. So one other item of interest, you might be asking yourself already, how long is each stage? What we've seen from observations, both consulting, teaching, and from the exemplar companies, each stage is about 18 to 24 months, folks. So it is a journey, all right? We have another foundational element for you to get you grounded on supply chain risk, and that's something we call the 4 spheres of supply chain risk. Again, this is foundational elements within the book. Where do we feel the risks are? We feel there's 4 areas. On the top left, the supply base, of course, it's natural. The supply base is where a lot of organizations start to essentially identify, assess, mitigate, and manage risks. On the right-hand side is demand events, demand risk events. Can you have a demand-driven disruption in your supply chain? You bet you can. There's almost as many frequency of occurrences of demand risk disruptors as there are supply. Demand is downstream through your customers and their customers. Supply base is upstream through their suppliers, your suppliers, and their suppliers. Third sphere, the process area. These are your processes. This is your sphere of influence, your supply chain. This is what we call everything within your 4 walls. These are your people, your process, and your systems and programs under your control. Can you have a process risk event? Yes, you can. And then the 4th sphere is actually huge, and that is what we call the environmental landscape. Those are things outside of our control. Those are the black swan events, the weather events, the disasters, the fires, the explosions, man-made black swans. These are also things like geopolitical risks, all right? Things like country tariffs and taxes, regulations, and so forth. It's huge and getting larger, and it's impacting us because all our supply chains have or are going global. Last slide within the basics of supply chain, we wanted to give you a glimpse of what we are teaching at Lehigh University, Villanova, with APICS, and around the globe. And I'll tee up the 10 elements, just talk about them rather quickly. These are the elements, major elements, that we are educating the folks in the Lehigh MBA class, in our executive education classes. We teach ERM, Enterprise Risk Management, at Villanova in their executive MBA. These are the elements we train the attendees in the APICS certificate, which we'll talk about in a minute. But essentially, it's assessment, uncertainty, risk mitigation tactics, strategies. One large one is fraud, theft, and counterfeiting. All right, that is growing by leaps and bounds, and we're addressing that in all of our education workshops as well. Business continuity planning, putting together a risk response plan, more mitigation tools and techniques that you can use at home without a computer, and we're going to talk about some of those this afternoon. We talk about organizational development, governance, risk, and compliance. A little structure goes a long way. ERM, we think that's very important as a framework for good supply chain risk management, and then the 21st century supply chain maturity model that we profiled recently. What we also do is we utilize a heat map. As you can see, that's red, yellow, green. We've developed a heat map tool in the Lehigh MBA class. It's about 120 some odd questions of discovery. It's a maturity map as well. It serves as two functions: a supply chain maturity checkpoint and a supply chain risk checkpoint. It basically was received so well in the classroom that we now take it on the road. We use it in workshops and with clients. We've actually leveraged this entire body of knowledge for the APICS 12 credit certificate in supply chain risk management. We've basically, I think, put more than 1,000 professionals through the day-long course and through the 12 credit hour sessions over the last 4.5 years. So we'd like to give credit to APICS for picking up on supply chain risk management early on, basically 4 years ago. And something brand new that's coming down the road from an education point of view is we're putting together a supply chain risk management simulation game, kind of like the beer game, which many of us may have played in terms of supply chain historically. This one is how to show the cause and effect relationships when you have to deal with supply chain risks and risk events. With that, I'd like to move to our next segment, and that is basically some classic stages of the S&OP maturity model, and we'll talk a little bit about exemplar companies. First and foremost, kind of a busy slide, but essentially what I'd like to do is I just want to talk about this 4-stage S&OP maturity model. It originated way back when with Gartner. I use it because I'm familiar with it. I still think it's relevant. I used it when I was an S&OP process owner for 3 different Fortune 100s. So what do we have? On the top, we have the 4 stages. Stage 1 is reacting, 2 is anticipating, 3 is collaborating, and 4 is orchestrating. What I want to do is just focus your attention today on 2 elements on the left-hand side: the goals in each stage and the techniques and technologies that tend to be leveraged during those 4 stages. So with that, we have two profiles here, stage 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Let's start with the goal of stage 1. The goal of stage 1 is basically very simple. Develop an operational plan. Basically put together an operational meeting to get the same people in the meeting, key people within all the departments together, get them to meet on a regular basis, start the development of an outline, and get a meeting going. You might say, that sounds pretty simplistic, Greg. Well, it is, but based on the scope and scale of your organization, it's not the easiest thing to do, all right? Because why is it that difficult? 1, it's new. 2, there's no street credibility yet. It's brand new. It's a new formal structure. And the techniques and technology to be leveraged tend not to be advanced. So at this point in time, when you start this S&OP process, you're trying to develop an operational plan. Normally you have what available to you? Excel spreadsheets down on the bottom. You may have an ERP system that has some supply chain capabilities. If you do, when you start an S&OP process, you're ahead of the game. Simple stage one, get a meeting together, start talking with all the departments, meet on a regular basis, get the right people in the meeting, and then start to make some inroads into your demand supply arena. Stage one. Stage two, a different goal. And that goal under anticipating is the pure demand and supply matching. Now think of it this way. You've been running your S&OP meetings for a good long time, could be a year, could be more, and now you are ready to truly attempt to match supply with demand and so forth. And how do you do that in this stage? Normally you still have some Excel spreadsheets, but you may have purchased and implemented a demand management forecasting system. You probably have some tools that do some heavy lifting for inventory management, general supply chain planning tools. Maybe you even have some inventory optimization. This is all good. Normally, as you move forward in stage two, you are building credibility. You are looking at asking for more funds, perhaps some resources, and you're attempting to match supply and demand for the good of the enterprise. The third stage, collaborating. The goal is again completely different. Now the goal after stage one and two is basically drive profitability, all right? And we'll talk about how you can do that in a couple of minutes. But the goal tends to be profitability. And what tools and techniques do you normally have to support that goal? Normally you're doing what if analysis, perhaps for demand shaping. You're bringing in promotions. You're bringing in and collaborating with your new product introduction R&D team. There are more departments collaborating together within the S&OP process. You have the capability to do what if analysis for reconciliation with financial plans. You may even be doing what we call total cost to serve, which we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. So third stage, profitability with some brand new tools, especially scenario planning and what if tools. And then the fourth stage, orchestrating, those goals are a little bit different as well. By this time, you probably have tools and techniques to do demand sensing, getting more and more information from pure demand from your customers. You're looking at perhaps conscious trade-offs for demand shaping to drive optimized responses. What are the tools you're utilizing here? Probably more and more big data and predictive analytics tools. You're probably using those tools to identify, assess, mitigate, and manage risk within the confines of your entire end-to-end supply chain. You're probably exercising risk management techniques, which we just talked about. We're going to talk about some more. You might even be doing price optimization, and chances are you're doing complex simulation, meaning you've digitized your supply chain and you're running scenarios within your supply chain to take a look at trade-offs. Very exciting. Still think those four stages are very relevant. And here's the rub. Essentially what we see as academics, as consultants, and through my 30 years of operations, on average, if you ask anyone around the world, about 20% of the world's manufacturers are in stage one. About 47 to 50% are normally in stage two. About 19 to 20% tend to jump over the wall into stage three, which is collaborating, and about 15% or so are in orchestration. So I wanted to briefly go through those four stages. We think they're still relevant. What we try to do is just talk about the dissimilar goals and then how to achieve those goals, especially with tools and techniques. What I'd like to do is take a look at what stages 3 and 4 tend to look like from an exemplar company point of view. What do they do when they're in stage 3 and stage 4? Well, first and foremost, they get into what we call scenario planning. And what we're seeing more and more is scenario planning with probabilities. All right, something we tend not to talk too much about in our daily supply chain arena, and that's the probabilities of occurrence. But as you can see, what they tend to do is they run scenarios, and in those scenarios, they talk about up at the top, best case, down the bottom, worst case, and in the middle, most likely. Most of us understand that scenario planning approach if you've run certain projects. On the right-hand side, what we want to profile from the exemplars is they're also doing what-if scenarios. They tend to be stress testing their supply chains using, as we said, digitizing their supply chains and using tools like discrete event simulation and probabilistic tools. What are they doing? Well, they're trying to understand, as you can see in the graph, they're trying to understand how their supply chains will react to certain disruptors, whether it's demand, supply, process, or what we call the environmental landscape. They're looking for cause and effect, folks, with some statistical significance that they can believe in. If this happens, then this will happen to my inventory, my capacity, and so forth. They get a picture image of their supply chain by scenario, by supply chain risk disruption. There's more. Wanted to share with you, many of the folks are using probabilistic tools, the exemplars. They are using these tools to calculate probabilities of occurrence within these scenarios for each scenario. Now, on the left-hand side of the graph, we have a triangle. Think of it as an area curve. Think of it as area under the curve. This triangle represents the scenarios from high probability of occurrence on the top left to low probability of occurrence. And I struck a line in the middle called scenarios. What we have seen over the last 10 years is when folks run scenarios in their supply chain, on average, 95% of those scenarios are what we would call tactical and operational, all right? And then about 5, maybe 10% on the bottom below the scenario line are what we call strategic scenarios or strategic events. So essentially, it's a little bit of the 80-20. What we're seeing is, on average, 90 to 95% of all scenarios are pretty tactical and operational in terms of events, and items, scenarios below that horizontal line tend to be strategic, all right? So essentially, tactical and operational scenarios, folks, above the scenario line tend to have very high frequencies of occurrence, and the strategic events below the scenario line tend to have low probabilities of occurrence. What the exemplars are also doing is for every scenario, folks, they are basically appending a risk associated with the occurrence. And they use certain tools like FMEA, techniques like RPN, value at risk. And it's very interesting because, as you can see, this triangle is what we call an area curve as well. And the two triangles tend to be inversely proportional. What do we mean? The high probabilities of event, the tactical and operational scenarios, tend to have lower total impact of risk on the company. The smaller probabilities of occurrence that are strategic in nature tend to have a larger financial impact when you look at risk for each scenario. Why do these folks go through scenario planning and append risk? All in an attempt to do what we call and advocate risk response plan. They calculate the value at risk for each scenario, and then essentially they pick the top impacts, the financial impacts that are at the top of the scale in terms of financial negative impact to the organization, and build what we call risk response plans in an effort to mitigate those risks if in fact they occur. I want to break out into talking a little bit about strategies, driving profitability, and mitigating risk within the S&OP. Again, this is more or less what stage 3 and stage 4 exemplar companies are tending to exercise. We have 3 for you today. They look like this: PPM, CVM, and TCS. They are affectionately known as product portfolio management, customer value management, and total cost to serve. So we're going to go through and give you a glimpse of these 3 mitigation tactics that can be exercised within the S&OP process in stages 3 and 4. Let's take a look. I want to start with a 2012 survey. It's a bit dated, but a pretty good survey nonetheless. 300 some odd organizations a couple of years ago around the globe, and they asked questions of discovery about companies' product and SKU management. Here's what they found. I'm not going to give you all of them, but I'll talk a little bit about like the second one. 56% said one of the top 3 pain points: I have too many products or SKUs. Almost 50% described their companies as risk averse. That's okay. 45% manage their product portfolios and their SKUs with spreadsheets. Not surprising. And the last one I put in red. This is the key takeaway. Only 11% folks of the companies surveyed constantly said they monitor and or stop underperforming products. What does that mean? Well, I say this to you as a supply chain operations practitioner, professional. We in the profession are very good at launching new products, getting product out the door, best delivery, on time, under budget. We're very good at that. People pay us for that as a profession. What we're not very good at is we're not very good at getting rid of underperforming products. Why? 1, because it's emotional, and 2, and these folks hit on it, the key takeaway on the bottom, here's the reason: not only because it's emotional, but there's no methodology. What they came out with in this survey was, I thought it was very interesting, that a methodology needs to be templated and leveraged to drive recurring process improvement. Why don't we do it, folks? 1, because it's very emotional, but 2, we tend to have no time, no people, and no templates or tools to do this and evaluate it on a repetitive basis. So let's talk more about that. I wanted to share another survey back in 2010. This was from PRTM. Some of you may remember them. Again, they did a lot of work in the 90s and early 2000s associated with supply chain best practices and benchmarks. They are now, I believe, with PwC. And they did a survey back in 2010, 350 participants around the globe. The net, I identified 2 of them in red. At this point in time in 2010, 75% of the respondents expected an increase in the number of international customers. Why? Because everyone was saying we're going to grow our top line. What does that mean to supply chain? That means we're going to grow our supply chain around the globe. 66% expected a higher number of product variations to fulfill customer requirements. Folks, that's nothing more than code for we are going to have more SKUs in our supply chain. And so they came out with a very tactful observation, I thought. Down the bottom, most participants, they said, are looking to international customers for future market growth, yet few are prepared for the complexity that results from serving global customers with regionally customized product. So I think they did a very nice tactful answer to their observation, but the issue was we're going to grow our top line and therefore we're going to grow the number of SKUs. Let's talk about SKUs. Under the definition of product portfolio management, kind of a busy slide. This is data coming from friends of the consortium who do supply chain analysis 50, 60 times a year around the globe with all these tools. What I want to share with you, the net folks, when you look at your SKUs, on average, 22% of all your SKUs account for 80% of the revenue and about 81% of the contribution margin. Now, essentially, if you have something that is totally different from that, I would certainly like to see that or hear about that with an email. But over time, and these folks do about 50, 60 supply chain analyses a year across the globe, they shared that information with us. Now, what are we to do with that type of profile? Well, we thought we'd share this with you in our discussion. Real quick, some of you may be aware of this, called GMROI, gross margin return on inventory investment. Essentially, the definition is this: it can be used to determine the amount of gross profit earned for each dollar invested in inventory on an annual basis. And it has its critics, but it's been received, it's been around for a while. A lot of consumer packaged goods retailers use it. It is simple, folks. It only has two elements. Those elements, one are GPN, gross profit margin. We all can find that. That's normally not very contentious by SKU. And the other one is inventory turnover rate, which we tend to, as practitioners, manage and watch and calculate. So it's gross profit margin and turnover rate annualized. And when they do that, when someone does it, you may say, well, we don't have a tool, we don't have people. Many folks, again, do this as a service, and here's what they do. I wanted to share with you what they do in terms of looking at your product portfolio. They basically calculate GMROI for every SKU. You can do that when you go home tomorrow as well, sure. Here's what they then do. They plot those SKUs and they plot them into a 2x2. All right, on our y-axis on the left, we have inventory turns from low to high. On the x-axis, we have gross margin from low to high. Essentially, what do? They take all your SKUs, then they start to plot them on a 2x2. Let's talk about the lower left, which are in red. Those are low margin, low turn SKUs. They're red, they're highly suspect. Let's talk about the blue SKUs on the bottom right-hand side. We call them workable. Why? Because they have high margins, but they have low turns. Up on the upper left, we have something called constant evaluation. We have the yellow SKUs. Those are low margin, but high turns. And then on the top right, we have the ideal quadrant, which are in green. And basically, those are high margin, high turnover items. What essentially you want to do is once they plot them, then you want to invoke techniques and tactics to attempt to move those products above that diagonal line. Let's take a look at another methodology, customer value management. Basically, revenue alone, folks, is a misleading indicator of customer value. We submit again, over time, 20% of your customers generate 80% of your profits. All right. Again, if that's not the case, I would like to, hear an email from you, and we could talk about that. All right. So what do we do about this 80-20 approach? Well, we think there's an approach. We call it CVM. customer value management. Here's the dilemma, folks, before we talk about it. We in organizations in supply chain, we tend to treat every customer the same in terms of supply chain delivery. We think that's leaving a lot of money on the table and invoking a lot of risk in the supply chain. And so our approach is to segment the customer base. Many of us don't do this. We like to segment customers into 4 different arenas. On the left-hand side, we call champions. Those are in green. What are those? Those are high revenue to your company, and they have those champions have a low cost to serve. And the second area on the left is something we call demanders. They give your company high revenue throughout those SKUs, but they have a high cost to serve. You know, very particular specific windows of delivery, penalties, and so forth. The third segment is what we call acquaintances. Those provide low revenue to your organization, and they have a low cost to serve. And then finally on the right, we affectionately call these customers losers. Why? And they're in red. Because they provide a low revenue to you and a very high cost to serve. And now we don't have enough time in our webinar, but we wanted to give you a couple of approaches. What do you do with the champions? We say you nurture them, get more and more and more of them. Loyalty cards, you name it. You want more champions. How about the demanders? Well, you can grow them because they're high revenue and basically attempt to reduce the cost to serve. On the acquaintances, grow the revenue. Basically, that's what you want to do because they have low cost to serve. And then the losers, well, we would advocate improve the profitability of those customers or cut them loose, folks. And I know it's difficult. Probably most of us on the call have never fired a customer. I have. It's very emotional, and that's why we are providing you with some techniques like customer segmentation and then total cost to serve to help you take some of the emotion out of that dialogue. Finally, we have total cost to serve. This is customer segmentation together with product portfolio management. Again, the folks who do this for a living as a service, we wanted to just show you what the template looks like. On the left-hand side, we have the product classification. You can see that the classical A and B SKUs are at the top. The C, Ds, and Es, the dogs and cats by SKU, are on the bottom. In the top, we have our customer classification on margin. The A's and B's are on the left, top left. The C, D's, and E's are on the right-hand side. Up on the top left, we have a very profitable situation. On the bottom right, we have a very unprofitable situation. And essentially what happens. Normally, when you plot all the customers and their SKUs in a 2x2, basically it's a focus on these 2 quadrants. The copper quadrant, basically we tweak them, and in the coal, affectionately known as coal, you want to shove them. What do you want to do? You want to move all these SKUs and customer combinations above this diagonal as well. Very compelling. Try to take the emotion out of it, but it's looking at your SKUs, segmenting your customers, and then doing a total cost to serve. We then, the folks who do this as a service tend to take this and help clients devise different supply chains for different customers and SKUs. And what does that do, folks, over time? It reduces the cost to serve, it reduces the risk to your supply chain, and increases your profits. And we have a few examples for you. From folks who have done this, companies that have enacted portfolio management basically report EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes, anywhere ranging from an improvement of 3 to 6 points. Take a look at some of these. Cost to serve reduction, 1 to 2 points. Capital management improvement, that's cash flow, 1 to 2 points. Increased net pricing and margin, 1 to 2 points. We have a couple of examples. Here's a consumer packaged goods, folks, with products, 5,000 customers, 500 products, defined a tool, did the cost to serve ABC driven model, came up with these results. 57% reduction in SKUs, 7.5 million margin improvement. We have a few more. Healthcare manufacturer, 5,400 products. Basically, they integrated a tool as a product portfolio management within their S&OP process, resulting in a 26% SKU reduction. That was 4,000% return in project. That project gave a 4,000% return on internal rate of return. So they beat their internal rate of return hands down. We have another one. I wanted to share this with you. Back in 2014, we saw this. P&G was told the street they were going to get rid of 90 brands. Let's take a look at that. At that time, they had 160 brands, less 90. That gave them 70 brands left as of 2014. Those 70 brands represented about 90% of their $83 billion in revenue. Therefore, 56% of their brands equaled only about 10% of their revenue. The CEO at that time laughingly said, we're going to create a faster growing and more profitable company that is far simpler to manage and operate. The shares of P&G jumped more than 3% that day. What does it look like today, folks? Here's what we see. Their fiscal year goes July through June. In July 26, they had these types of results. Net sales decreased by 8%. That's understandable. The net earnings per share increased by 51% fiscally. Adjusted free cash increased by 115%, and the company gave back $7 billion to the shareholders in the form of dividends. I would say that's SKU rationalization on steroids, and I think everyone was basically pretty happy with those results after about 18 months of operation. So with that, let's have some closing thoughts. Do a little recap. What did we talk about? Profitability, stage 3 and 4 in the S&OP process. We broached total cost to serve model. We talked about product portfolio management. We talked about customer segmentation, a bit of a risk management framework, some network analysis, all wrapped around scenario planning within your sales and operations planning. So to highlight them again, cost to serve models we're advocating, product portfolio management, which is SKU rationalization. Think about segmenting your customers. Think about risk management within your S&OP process, and we'll give you a bit of a roadmap, and then we'll have some questions. What I have here on this slide is as you can see on the left-hand side from top to bottom, are the 4 stages of the S&OP maturity model we talked about. What we do here is we circle the areas and the elements, the techniques that we talked about: total cost to serve, product portfolio management, customer segmentation, driving profitability within the S&OP process. Then on the right-hand side, we advocate injecting supply chain risk management into the equation, especially using new tools like discrete event simulation, probabilistic modeling, predictive analytics, and risk response plans. We think that's a very, very compelling new math, 1 + 1 = 3, all right? With that, I'll leave you with a couple of takeaways, and then we can spend some time on questions and answers. One takeaway, we feel the companies need to understand the business importance of their different products and customers and align to them properly. Companies should segment, or what we call tier, their customers because they're not all the same. And then once you do that, develop efficient and effective supply chains, folks, based on total cost to serve models. and companies should begin to inject risk overtly into their S&OP discussions. All right, that basically concludes our presentation. And now we said we'd save some time for Q&A, so I'll relinquish the podium back to John.
Great, thank you, Greg. Really, really rich and robust content that you've shared. We'd like to give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions you might have for Greg. As a reminder, click on the Q&A tab, which is located on the side of the screen. Enter your question and click the Ask button. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, I'll highlight that Greg will be presenting a couple of sessions for us this year at APICS 2017 in San Antonio. One of those is his educational session is the dilemma between today's procurement practices and good supply chain risk management. And then as well, he'll be presenting a spotlight session, which will be housed on the floor of the exhibit hall, and that's on supply chain risk and resiliency, a 2017 snapshot. So we look forward to content coming from Greg as part of really 3 days of outstanding education that's going to be taking place at the conference. So with that, I will go ahead and take a look at these questions, and let me start with this one, Greg, that came in. So many vendors offer S&OP platforms that can do simulations and support discrete events and probabilities. So do you have any insights in that in terms of, are there a lot of solutions that are out there and, that people can give consideration to assist in this process?
The question, let me reiterate the question. Yes, there are tools and techniques out there, solution providers. I would advocate, and I can't really say with confidence which is better than the others. That's not what we do. But essentially, if in fact you're at that level where you have an S&OP process, it may be at the end of stage 2, might be early stage 3. You have the right people, you have a process, you have some tools and techniques, you have some street credibility. People believe in your outcomes. You've demonstrated some value. That is an ideal time to begin to talk about digitizing the supply chain, whether it's a product line, a division, and then running scenarios to essentially take a look at how your supply chain will react. I don't want to mention names. There are many of them out there. Some just have discrete event simulation capabilities where they'll show cause and effect in terms of if my demand goes up, then my inventory might go up, my capacity will change this way with statistical confidence. Others have probabilistic tools if you're getting into calculating the probability of that risk event and then trying to mitigate that. Those are different types of tools, but there are enough tools out there, folks. What we've seen, I'll end the discussion on this question with this. What we've seen is 5 years ago, when surveyed, only 20-some% of folks around the world, when surveyed, basically said we're using some type of tool to simulate how our supply chain will react. It's up to about 45% now. So it has grown in 5 years. And with that growth of demand, folks, will come more and more tools and techniques. That's the best way I could answer that question.
Great, thanks, Greg. So next question. This is coming from an S&OP standpoint. What is the timeline where a SKU is not called new anymore and can be added to the GMROI analysis?
That's a good question. One, it's based on your product life cycle. 2, it's the industry you're in. 3, it's the competition. If you're in pharmaceutical, it's a little different product life cycle than commercial electronics with PCs, laptops, and so forth. So that's a tough question. I'd be more concerned about taking a look at those new SKUs. Maybe we could talk about it this way. If you're constantly adding new SKUs to your product portfolio, I would basically run those SKUs in GMROI as well. And now you've got to give them a certain length, a product life cycle length. I don't know what that is, but I wouldn't treat them any different other than to fight for them if in fact they are new. I don't really feel comfortable giving a life cycle number of weeks or months, folks, because that varies by the industry you're in, the competition, the product line, and so forth. Sorry.
That's great. Thanks, Greg. And then just time for one final question for you. How does someone make an impact to risk management in the smaller world of being a procurement agent for a specific commodity in a very large global company when they're not a direct part of the S&OP process? So again, thinking about risk management, but not participating directly in that S&OP process.
Okay, first I would advocate you got to get procurement in there, all right? I would advocate that under the get them in the tent. Everybody's got to be in the tent. But if in fact that's not the case for now, when you go back to your office and desk and team, I would advocate that you begin to identify the risks with your suppliers. If you run if you're a commodity manager, first thing you can do is start to build what we would call some key risk indicators for the products and suppliers that you are responsible for. You can do this in Excel, but you might have additional data available to you in your procurement team where you can start to build what we would call a heat map. You know, things like quality, which are things that many procurement folks do. They look at price, delivery, quality, but things like financial viability. All right, we don't have enough time, but there's something, I'll give you this, there's something called the Altman Z-score. It's been around for 30 years. It's what we call a poor man's supply dashboard. It is a calculation that you fill in the blanks. It's been around, you can Wikipedia it, been around for 30 years, both for public and private companies. You could, if you can garner the information on your suppliers, you can actually populate these algorithms, very simplistic, and guess what? These algorithms have a 95% forecast accuracy with those algorithms to forecast bankruptcy, potential bankruptcy 15 to 18 months in the future. If you can find that Altman Z-score and start to use that as a key risk indicator for your suppliers, even though you're not in the S&OP meeting, that's going to get attention, folks. That's my that's the most impactful I think answer I could give you at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg. So again, we'd like to thank our presenter, Greg Schlegel, for his time and great insights that he has shared today. We do thank everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at APICS 2017 in San Antonio. Don't forget to register using your discount code SATXSAVE50 to save $50 on your full conference registration. As a reminder, this session today counts as one elective credit hour towards the APICS S&OP Education Certificate and the APICS Supply Chain Risk Management Education Certificate. Visit apicsconference.org for more information and to register. This concludes today's APICS online event. Thank you for participating. All content and materials included in this APICS online event are the property of APICS and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved.